good afternoon and welcome. It is lovely to have you with us today. As I say, there's some of you, I look on the attendee list and I say, oh, I know those people, and there's others that I go, oh, I don't. So it's lovely to meet you. Nice to connect with you. If you don't know me, my name is Zoe Lewis. I'm the CEO here at the Leadership Coaches. And what we do is exactly what it says on the tin. We coach leaders. So our work is primarily in one-to-one executive coaching. We also do team coaching, leadership development and talent development programs. So just in a nutshell, that's who we are. I am joined today by the wonderful Ian. It is fabulous to have Ian with us today. So Ian has been with us since the start. So yes, a long-term colleague of ours, and Ian is a specialist in terms of doing leadership and management development. He does a lot of work with us, particularly focusing around leadership development, team coaching, and also management development. So as he talks through today, he is definitely in a position of knowledge. He's going to tell me off now because he doesn't like too much praise coming his way. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Ian, and I will be in the background. I will turn my camera off, but there is a Q&A box. So if there's anything that you wish to ask in the Q&A, I will come on towards the end and I will host that one. So over to you, and thank you, Ian.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. My name is Ian White, and we're looking today at how do we actually influence the board? How do we influence up, really, and what do we do? So hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation. I'll talk you through it. One of the things that we're thinking about doing today. So we're going to be thinking about what the board wants, really, and why the board should care, and what is it that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we position ourselves, how we position our proposals, our ideas, things that we're doing, how we're going to position that so that we see a lot that it's well received by the board or by senior leaders. And the sort of things that are on their mind, and are we absolutely making sure that we're hitting all the things that are on their mind, and how might that be different a little bit from the way perhaps we're thinking about our project or our proposal or the things that we're wanting to suggest as an ideas, things that the board should be considering. We're then going to move on to what we do in terms of how we influence before we get to a decision, before we get our proposal maybe perhaps heard at board level or at senior leader level. So what we're doing in preparation is very, very important, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, and how do we influence and how do we get ready. And finally, we're going to have some thinking about the sort of questions that we tend to get from boards, what sort of questions we have, how do we respond to those questions, what's a good way to respond to those questions, if we get pushback, what's a good way to think about that, respond to that, prepare for those questions, because we're going to get some, aren't we? The board are about to have questions and the senior leaders are about to have questions. Some of those may be quite easy for us to think about, but other ones could be pretty probing questions which maybe we've got to go away and think a little bit about. So those are 3 things we're going to do, and we're going to start with the first one, and thinking therefore about why do good ideas fail? And quite a few people may have thought going into a proposal that what they had was actually a really good idea and was going to be really beneficial for the company, the organisation, things we wanted to achieve in the organisations. People were going to benefit from this. You know, how could anybody sort of say no, really? But people do, don't they? And people have had what they consider to be good ideas not get across the line. So let's have a little bit of a think about that and why that may have happened, and the sort of reasons that were given here on the slide. So maybe there's no budget. Perhaps that might be something that we're told that there's no money at the moment for this, or you know, they might actually be in a position where there is a reduced amount of spending going on. So sometimes that's true, sometimes that isn't so true. My experience is that boards and senior leaders do seem to find the money for what they want to spend money on, and they may be able to reassign money and move money about a little bit and think about how they want to spend some of their already allocated budgets. So yeah, but perhaps it's no budget, perhaps wrong timing, which is interesting, isn't it? Because we'd like to think that we were aware of that perhaps beforehand, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Do senior leaders not get it? I mean, that maybe is one of the things, isn't it? That actually didn't seem to land very well, didn't seem to impact in the way that perhaps we thought the proposal was going to impact and land. and perhaps we weren't quite sure why, and we weren't able to get our point across. We sort of tried, but actually, wasn't really quite getting through. We know as well that politics is alive and well in the boardroom, and it's alive and well at senior leadership level, and some of that we'll be aware of, some of that perhaps we'll be less aware of, but there will be sometimes competing egos is perhaps a bit a strong word, but it sort of competing ideas, competing sort of priorities, and so it's with those are things we've got to also think about and consider. In my experience, boards and senior leaders are willing to take risk. They're willing to take calculated risk. They're certainly happy when things maybe reduce risks or some of the risks that they're facing. But perhaps if they sort of think it's too risky. And then the last one, which we perhaps know about, and because that's the name of this webinar, is we didn't get the buy-in, did we? There wasn't the people there to say, actually, yeah, we see this, we commit to it, we want to go with your proposal. It's a good proposal. I'm willing to back it. So often those are the reasons that we're given. They may be the real reasons, or there may be underlying reasons, like we just didn't present it in the right way and we didn't get some of those elements that we're looking for. Let's have a little bit of a think then about what boards are looking for when we sort of think about these sort of things. So unlike people who are working more operationally, so if you sort of think about the people who are making presentations to boards or wanting ideas put through, they may have a strategic position. They may be like, just below the board and those sort of things. But oftentimes we still have a bit of an operational element, don't we, to the things that we're doing. So though we may have a strategic element, we've also got an operational element, and that is perhaps less so the more senior we become in an organisation. So at the board level, certainly at senior leadership level, there's far more about strategic thinking and strategy, and a little less actual operation and doing. So the people who are asking about the proposals, us, if you like, you, coming to board, are often coming from a little bit of a different perspective than the board. And this is a really important thing to be able to get ourselves into their shoes and thinking about what is it they want to hear from me, and where do I take my thinking in order to get myself in a slightly different place than my day-to-day. So these are sort of four areas that somebody in senior leadership or somebody on the board is thinking about when they're thinking about a proposal or an idea. And number one, of course, is what is the impact going to be on our business? What's the impact going to be on the organisation? How do we know is also part of that. But what is the impact going to be on our business? And critically, that question, which is, where does it fit into our strategy, things that we're doing, things that we're trying to do in our 5-year plan? Where does this help? Where does it work alongside? Which problem in this strategy is this proposal helping me to solve? And I can say, yes, this works into these elements of the strategy. So what's the organizational impact? Confidence is another quite important thing for board and senior leaders. They do buy confidence, and that's not just you being confident or me being confident in front of them whilst presenting. That's also a sense of built in there is this idea of credibility, isn't it? What's your personal credibility? What's my personal credibility? How much confidence do they have in you, in me, if I was making that presentation? What's their confidence that that I've done my research, that I've got my background, that I've understood, that I know what I'm talking about, and some of that confidence comes through asking questions too, doesn't it? So there'll be questions that they're asking and things that they're doing. We've already mentioned strategic value. Where does the organizational impact and strategic value sort of tie in, don't they? What is the strategic impact? Where does it fit into the plan? And earlier we talked about this idea of reducing risk, and that doesn't mean no risk. Because nothing comes with no risk, does it? So there's always a risk, there's always a business risk. But the question is, what have we done about that risk? What we're thinking about the risk? How do we mitigate the risk? How do we know what that risk is? And how are we going to know in terms of, as perhaps our proposal progresses, where are those thinking about risk and what's going to happen in risk? So on the right-hand side, you can see, how we're going to measure it. Is it worth the risk? I think one of the other questions which we are going to look at a few times as we go through this is this idea of what happens if we don't act? So what is currently in place in the organization for this? It may be something, it may be nothing. And what are the risks? What's the strategic value? What's the organizational impact of doing nothing or changing nothing in the organization? Because I've had many conversations with CEOs, MDs, and people on board, and they will often speak about the impact of doing nothing. So it's often on people's minds at that level, which is doing nothing is a decision in itself. So sometimes we can be a bit slow with our decision making. Sometimes boards and senior leaders can, or any leaders can sometimes be a bit slow with their decision making. But that in itself is an action, isn't it? It's an inaction, but we in that doing nothing, what happens then? What's the impact of doing nothing? So I think that's certainly something which should be part of our presentation and something which is certainly part of our thinking when it comes to questions. There is a risk in doing things. There's also a risk in doing nothing. So, but we'll come back to that. So there's sort of 4 areas where we start to think a little bit more about how do we get ourselves making sure that what we're talking about really does line up with the board or the senior team that we're talking with. And this is just trying to really categorize that between operational thinking and strategic thinking. So I think that even though we may think we're thinking strategically, it is a really good idea to sit down, think hard about our proposals and think what we're doing and just go through a checklist like this one and start thinking about how much have I talked about these things in this proposal? How much is my operational element? How much is things I feel very invested in? Because often we become very invested in our proposals and we can become very invested in the elements of our proposals that mean a lot to us, and those things can come through in our proposals, which is great because obviously it's showing our passion, our interest, that we personally are very invested, but they can often represent things that don't really resonate with the board or with senior leaders. So what's really important is to make sure that, if you like, we've decontaminated a little bit or a lot things that are in our proposals which actually are really about us and what our passions are, and don't really fit into the things that the board or the senior leadership team, they really want these answers around these things. So here, if perhaps there's an over focus on the details of the program itself, so describing the activities, what's going to happen. You might have a timeline in there, which is a timeline is a good thing in terms of an overview, but maybe there's a little bit more too much detail in there in terms of exactly what's going to happen. Perhaps there's also a lot there about, because when we're talking about participant experience, for you that might be something which is actually really critical. What is the experience of the people on the course or the program or my proposal? What's the experience of people in the different departments when we're thinking about how we collaborate better, the sort of things you want to bring together and do? What's their experience of it? And that does matter because it has value, doesn't it, in terms of them perhaps feeling valued, perhaps feelings of belonging, or the things that, and if those things are part of the strategic plan and the values of the organization, that fits really well. But if they're not, or they're not really the focus of the board or the senior leadership team at that point, it's like that's a nice thing to have thing rather than a central, this is the thing that we're all about, then that isn't going to resonate at board level. That's going to be like, oh yeah, so some nice things here to have, but it's not really ticking the boxes in terms of what we want and what we need to achieve at board. So where it says talks about coaching, that could be what you're doing there. You could be doing something like maybe you're doing like a coaching program. I can't imagine why I thought about coaching as part of this, but then so it's how talking about too much, I suppose. And it's interesting about success measures, isn't it? Because what might be successful for you and for me when we're presenting to the board, we've got to be absolutely sharp about, is this exactly success as the board and senior leadership see it? Is it the same success? Is what I think is success, like we've delivered a great program and people are raving about it, people are talking about it, going to the open area, we go into the sort of shared areas and people are buzzing, that's like win, fantastic, got it. Now, that might not be a win for senior leadership of the board. It might be another nice to have. So what are, as it says on the other side, we'll have a quick look at the bottom of the other side, success equals measurable organisational outcomes. What exactly is the impact of this on the bottom line? But that bottom line may very also be things to do with, staff surveys, or it could be things to do with attrition and those other sorts of things that really matter for organisations. What's our talent recruitment like? What's our talent attraction like? What's our talent retention like? So all of those really measurable organisational outcomes, where's the success? Yeah, people are talking about it, but actually it had no impact on the sort of things we're trying to achieve in our strategic plan. So it's nice everyone feels better and it gets this nice good feeling around everywhere, which does count, and it does count in terms of morale and people feeling their belonging. It does have some impact there, but it might not be exactly what the board and senior leaders are thinking about. So be really super focused on what it is success like for them, and what is it like for the organization. So as you can see on the strategic thinking right hand side, is it a focus on organizational outcomes? Mention a strategy. What's the business impact and capability? I think there's two sort of things there when I think about capability, because that's what you're hoping is this will also improve, isn't it? We're going to improve our capability and maybe also our capacity. It might be that people can do more because of the things that we're going to do with this. They might be more focused, they might be able to prioritize better, there might be improved delegation, collaborative working might mean that we have big savings in efficiency, for instance. So you've got those capacity, as well as the fact that people just become more capable of what they do. And so that high level of capability leads to better productivity, better outcomes in terms of what we actually can achieve. So I think capability and also capacity, very important as business outcomes. So yeah, here's the investment. What's the ROI? ROI can be a tricky one, because we know, don't we, that when we're thinking about return on investment, and everyone knows this, board know this, senior leadership know this, is that there's lots of things that influence an outcome. Okay, we're not working in a vacuum where we can just completely isolate this program or that program or external or change to our competitors. What exactly did that small thing have as an impact on ROI? But we should nevertheless be able to sort of see through the efficiencies or collaborative working or increases in capacity and capability that we've spoken about, what are we likely to see as a return? And what are we looking for as a return on our investment? Where are the costs now? I mean, I think this brings us a little bit back to that. What if we do nothing? Well, at the moment, we're getting quite a lot of grievances. At the moment, our attrition is quite high. We got quite a lot of turnover, and people who come on our sort of 5-year program aren't staying afterwards. So there's a cost to that, and that should be something which you could actually cost out. So that is a return on investment if those things improve, isn't it? As well as just savings from collaborative working or other elements that you're trying to do. Okay. So hopefully then that's made us all think a little bit more about, am I thinking like the board, basically? And this, I think, is a nice graphic just to sort of put that into context for us and have this sort of simple framework, why, what, impact, as a good approach when we're thinking about bringing in proposals, bringing ideas to either boards or senior leaders. And I think it's a really good question, that first one, isn't it? Why should the board care? Why should I care about your proposal? Why should I care about your idea? And yeah, good question. Why should you care? So here's the reason why you should care. And those things we've already just talked about. I've got all these things. It fits the organisational impact. We've got all the strategic ideas, and this is where it fits in with the strategic plan. And this is what's going to help you achieve over the next 5 years that you've already identified you want to achieve. So why would the board care? I think that's a really good question. Be very clear about what it is that you're doing. Okay, make sure it's not ambiguous. Make sure there's some real clarity behind what you're saying and doing, and clearly then being very, very clear about the impact of this. What part of the strategic plan, what part of the organisation, what exact tangible benefits are we talking about? I have listened to proposals in the past which have been a little vague. So if we're sort of just saying things like improved retention, say, that's well, okay. So does that mean if one less person, we have a turnover of one less individual, that's a success? Or are we looking, what exactly percentages are we talking about? How many people are we talking about? What exact impact are you looking for here in terms of the sort of metrics that we want to use? So how will it be measured? Being very clear, very tangible outcomes. And again, mentions here about inaction, doesn't it? There's a cost to inaction. There's a cost to action. There's a cost to everything. Everything's got a cost. Everything's got a price. But let's have some clarity about those things. So yeah, think like a board member. Get yourself in their shoes, and try to make sure that we've thought a little bit about that. Okay, let's move on a little bit then and think about how do we develop that proposal? How do we think about that proposal? How do we test out that proposal? How do we get to the point when we present that we're in the best possible place? I did work with somebody once who, in terms of proposals and ideas and strategy, said to me that they never went into a meeting without knowing what the outcome was going to be before they went into the meeting. Now, I'm not too sure we can have 100% confidence like them in some of the meetings that we go into when we bring about our proposals, but I think we could be in a position where we go into that meeting where we're making our presentations, and maybe there'll be a decision made in that meeting or shortly after that meeting, or maybe some people will get together or be delegated that decision-making capability. But we should be in a position before we go into that meeting that we are pretty confident we've done everything we need to do, and we're in a very strong position to see this thing go over the line. We shouldn't be there necessarily thinking, I am not sure which way this is going to go, or I have no idea how this is going to be received. And there's really no reason why we should be in that position. And here's an iceberg. You've probably seen lots of icebergs over the years for lots of different things, but this is a really good way of thinking about it. Above the surface, you've got your presentation, the actual meeting, the questions you might be given, and you've got a decision, tick or cross. Okay, but there's so much more going on under the surface. That's the point about the whole iceberg analogy, isn't it? That is much more below the surface than you see above the surface, and that's really where we want to be when we're thinking about influencing and understanding what's going on and understanding what we need to do before any of the visible stuff starts to happen. And you can see there's quite a lot of things like informal conversations, are so important. I mean, you might just have to have some formal ones where you sort of ask somebody, look, I really need you to sit down with you, talk through my ideas, and I need you to pull it apart for me. I need you to sort of tell me exactly where I'm going wrong with this and where, what am I missing, where are the gaps. So it might be some formal conversations, but there might also just be some informal conversations around just passing what's on your mind at the moment. I'm thinking of doing something around this. What's resonating with the board at the minute? What's the board talking about at the moment? What's senior leadership struggling with at the minute in terms of where they're trying to get to in terms of their strategic plan? Just having those informal formal conversations beforehand, gathering information, trying to understand what's happening, getting a rounded idea. And I think the rounded idea is actually really important. I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but when you talk to one person, you can get a very, very different view and perspective than if you speak to other people. So it's really important to not just focus on one or two people in this case, is it? Where am I going to get that rounded view from? Where am I going to get those different perspectives from? Who am I going to talk to in order to get those different perspectives and a different view on this, so that I can, perhaps see it in the best possible light. And that, of course, will feed into your presentation, won't it? All the things you're picking up there is going to really influence your approach and what you're going to say, and when you're putting yourself in the shoes of senior leaders and people at board level. So it's a great place to test your ideas. We've already mentioned that, really. Understand the priorities. What are the priorities at the moment for the board? What's on their minds? What's concerning them? What are their worries? What are they concerned about? What things about the business, are the sort of thing. What are their problems, if you like? Then, you know, what problems do they have that I can help fix? Is a really good idea, isn't it? So very good if you can build trusted relationships. Remember we said a bit earlier, you know, how confident are they in you to deliver this? Where's you as a leader, your levels of credibility in terms of implementing it? Because, you know, two people can have a good idea and one person implements that really well, the person perhaps doesn't implement it really well. Of course, that has a massive impact, doesn't it, on outcomes? So building trust, building your credibility, building confidence in you and your team. And also the last one there was like securing advocates. If you've got somebody on the board who's really going to sell this for you and with you, or at senior leadership level, that is gold dust, isn't it? So the big question here is, what influence are you building? What information are you gathering? What trust are you building? What are you doing well before you even write your proposal? Well before you're even thinking about that presentation to board? You know, and what wealth of information you're picking up and gathering in order to really present this sort of like rich presentation, which you know is going to land well, which you know is going to resonate, which you know is going to hit all the right sort of places because you've done your research and you've done your stuff beforehand. So yeah, plan to be ready and all those sorts of things. Okay, build your influence. And I don't know if anyone's done this practically. You might have sort of done it in your mind and thought, I just need to make sure I'm considering everybody in the room. And here on this influence network map, we've just put the CEO, the CFO, and the chair, but obviously there's going to be a lot more people in the room. And so this needs to be built for who are those decision makers, who's in the room that I need to be talked to and to convince, because they will, each person in the room has a slightly different lens, doesn't it? And I've been guilty of this in the past where I've spoken to the things that would appeal to me had I been in their shoes, or spoken to people who are perhaps in certain positions around the table, maybe the ones that interest me more, and I've sort of missed out some of the others. And in the past, the ones I have missed out have probably been the more sort of process sort of thinking people in the room. So the people who really value the process, really value the detail. So detail's this sort of big balancing point, isn't it? Because there'll be some people in the room who don't like a lot of detail. This one, give me the top level things. But you will get some people in the room who do like the detail. So think about how you're going to do that. But the question is it possible to sort of hit the bullseye? So hitting the bullseye will be defined as, you know, you're hitting all the areas, all the people, all their lenses, all the way they're looking at this all at the same time. Now, that's a tricky thing to do, but it's a good thing to have as an aim and a thing that you want to achieve in that presentation. So am I hitting all the boxes? Am I getting everyone right there? And just got some idea here about what the CEO would be after. CEOs typically do have a bit more of a strategic growth, you know, sort of picture. They're the ones who are directly accountable to the board or to shareholders, or if it's private equity, to the people that have got, they're still shareholders, but whether it's public or whether it's private, but they're the people that are thinking about, you know, I have to give account to the performance of this business. So they're in that sort of place. So being able to influence them and know, right, these are the things they need to hear. This is what the CEO needs to hear. We know that CFO will typically be slightly bit more concerned about, well, what's the cost and what's the return? And where am I going to get savings on this, or future savings? Or maybe some things that cost me at the moment won't be costing me in the future. Where's the value in this for us as a business? They've got to obviously think about the financial control, haven't they? So financial control is really important to the CFO, and so it should be. So we're thinking about, well, actually, I need to make sure I'm hitting what the CFO needs to hear, what the CEO needs to hear, and what the chair needs to hear. And the chair may very well be a bit also thinking about governance and risk and compliance a little bit more than the others. But overall, the concept here is, am I, as it says there, tailoring my message to who is in the room, who is in front of me, and what they want to hear? Or am I a bit too narrow in my presentation? And a lot of this then comes from all the things we saw with the iceberg, doesn't it? What conversations have I had with the CFO or people in their team? What conversations have I had with the CEO? You may not be able to get a lot of direct access with the CEO. You may be able to, but so who does know? and what is it they need to know, and what does it need to do, and where you're going to get that information from. So where you're going to get this information from, do your work beforehand. So we've looked a little bit so far at how do I get myself in that mindset, in that am I in the right mindset for people at board and senior leadership level? Am I being too operational? Am I properly strategic? Am I really considering the organizational outcomes and the strategy and the things that they want to know and the problems that they need solving? And then we've also looked at, well, how do I build that influence and also my information gathering well before we get to a point of making a presentation or even putting a presentation together. So that's what we've done so far. And now we're going to have a little bit of look at how do we manage pushback. So my experience of board and senior leaders is you often get some questions which you might think are a bit obvious, but also get some pretty probing questions. You can get some questions that, can be quite tricky to answer, maybe you need to go away and think about. So it's really important, isn't it, to be ready for pushback. And to think about beforehand, what are the sort of questions I'm likely to get? And that's maybe another part of your, the iceberg under the water, part of your sort of influencing and talking and having informal and formal conversations with people is also saying to them, what sort of pushback do you think I'm going to get? What question would you ask me? I just need to think about those questions. So being prepared that way, but there could always be a question I'm not quite ready for. But this model is also about, right, how do I deal with a question? And I think it's really important to acknowledge the question. Don't be dismissive about things. Don't just say, well, that's not going to be a problem, or that's not really something we have to deal with. Or that's not something I've come across. It's far better to say, I hear that, and to genuinely do this. We're not after sort of superficial responses and looking disingenuous in our responses, or even automatic or robotic, but to genuinely answer that question with high levels of curiosity and asking those questions around, I get that, I understand that's a real concern, and I do acknowledge that's a real concern, and part of your clarifying is part of that genuine curiosity. Tell me more about that. Could you just tell me a little bit more about where that question is coming from? What is it exactly you're looking for there? Or asking questions around, when you say that, what do you mean by that? What do you mean when you say that may not hit the strategy? Ask for more information, get clarity. One of the things that as human beings we are very good at is making assumptions. So making that assumption is somebody's asked this question, I'm joining the dots up, what they really mean is this, what they're really talking about is this is the answer which they really need. And we need to circumvent that and interrupt that and say, actually, let's just make sure I've properly understood where you're coming from. I've not just jumped to conclusions, not just made assumptions. So be curious, get clarification. And finally, when you do transition to an answer, making sure that answer has evidence and then go back to your proposal. Okay, it's really important that when we're answering the questions, we're always tying it back to, and this is where in the proposal that fits. This is where in the proposal that question gets answered. This is where we're looking and seeking to achieve that in the proposal, as well as whatever evidence that you may or may not have and sort of things that you've built up in your preparation. Okay, so acknowledge the question, go for clarification with curiosity, I would add there, and then transition to your proposal and evidence. This is where my proposal fixes that, answers that, does that. Okay, and finally I've just got a few ideas around how we respond. And it's quite careful. I think one of the things about preparing to go, if you're basically because you might be caught off guard, you might just be caught in the corridor or in an open area and someone might approach you to ask you a question, or it could be in the presentation, couldn't it, when you get in sort of like the pushback and some of the questions. If you know that there is somebody who tends to trigger you, who tends to ask questions in a way which sort of gets your back up, gets you feeling a little bit more perhaps put out by them, or somebody perhaps that you've had some conversations with in the past that haven't always gone very well, then it's really important to prepare for that, isn't it? And if this is something which you're so invested in, it's such a personal thing to you that some of the questions might feel personal. Maybe they don't. Maybe this is just a thing that you're doing because it's about achieving it for the organization. But if it's a bit more like your baby, it's your thing, it's something that you've created, then when that thing, that proposal, that baby gets criticized, that can sometimes put us not in the best of positions to respond to questions. So perhaps be overly defensive, or just the look on our face, our body language might change. There might be a change in our heart rate, and we might begin to get a bit sort of like hot, those sorts of things. So it's really important to plan and prepare for your own reaction to questions, but then think about what we say as well. So anything around you're wrong when you're asked a question is probably not the best way to sort of go forward. That's not correct. Now, it might not be like you to say, may I offer another perspective? They might think that's not the sort of thing you would usually say. But you might be more like you to say something like, well, there's another way of looking at this, which is this. Or perhaps we could look at it from a different angle, So find your language, but it's what you're trying to say rather than saying things like, you're wrong. And you might not say you're wrong quite in that way, but you might say something which implies, you're wrong, you're an idiot, whatever. So yeah, avoid those sort of things. You're not correct. Telling somebody they've misunderstood. I don't think you've quite got that, or I don't think you quite understood that part of my presentation. Again, it feels a bit personal, doesn't it? So perhaps steer away from that. Could I clarify this more? I think it's always a bad idea to sort of say, trust me. I can't imagine someone saying it. Maybe somebody would say, maybe you've said it, maybe people who have said it, just trust me, it'll be okay. But that, of course, they might trust you, but they're going to be a bit more than that, aren't they? And part of trusting you is that the evidence, and you can say, this is what the evidence is saying, this is what the data is saying, this is what our internal data, external data is telling us. There is, of course, never no risk, and that isn't life, is it? There's always risk in life. But what are you doing about the risk? How are you doing the risk? How are you monitoring the risk? How do you know what the risks are? And what are you doing to mitigate those risks? How are you going to be keeping an eye on that, which I've already said. And things like, we need this, and the reason this matters is this. The thing about I'll get back to you is just that it's not very time specific, is it? So obviously, like I said a few times, we do need to be careful with answering on in the moment if we're not certain. I mean, everybody will say, well, I hope everybody will say, it's far better to say, I need to get back to you, and we'll talk about how we can perhaps say it a little bit better, than it is to say something which you're making up, or something which you're partially making up in the moment because you feel under pressure to give an answer. So far better to say, I need to just go check a few things out about that. There's some elements of your question which just need a bit more information on my part. I will get back to you by the end of the day. I'll get back to you by the end of tomorrow. And then obviously whatever you say in terms of being specific about when you get back to people, you need to be very clear that you will do that. Okay, so you have to get back at the point that you say. So there's a few ideas really about if we get pushback, be prepared for the questions, what to avoid saying, what to say instead, but also using that model that we just looked at before as well. Acknowledge the question, go for curiosity, make sure you have got clarity about the question, and then always bring it back to your presentation. Okay, always do that. So don't delay. 3 things you could do tomorrow, 3 things for you to take away and think about. So think like the board. Why should they care? Build support early. Have those conversations. Get your information. Respond. Don't react. Stay curious. And if you can prepare for pushback questions before they come, make sure that you've prepared yourself for those things. So those are the 3 key areas that we've gone through today, which is, have you got yourself into the mindset of boards and senior leaders? Have you thought thoroughly about boards and senior leaders and how they're thinking and what's important to them? Have you then identified all things you need to before you even write your proposal, before you even go ahead to think about presenting your proposal? Who have you spoken to? Who have you had those conversations with? What have you tested out? Where have you built trust? Where have you got advocates? All those things that we talked about. And then the last thing we talked about was what happens when you get questions and pushback, and what's the best way to reflect on those. So that is the presentation finished.
Awesome, Ian. Thank you so much. I mean, I was just listening and thinking, gosh, that is a lot of rich content you've covered in a short amount of time. And I'm sure we haven't lost one member of the audience, which I think on a webinar is very impressive. So thank you so much. That was really insightful. We do have a question, and I've also got a couple of other questions to pose to you should we have time. So is that okay if I start with some questions?
You're asking me? Yes.
Yeah. I thought you might want to
well, like I had
up.
an option. I didn't realise I had options about these questions.
I'm just going to let you get your cuppa first. Okie dokie. So the first one comes in, and it's one that we hear a lot in terms of coaching. So let me just expand the question so that I can ask it fully. How do you present outcomes when they are genuinely fuzzy? I think the benefit of our coaching program is that managers know the organisation cares about them enough to give them that support, and that it forces them to pause and think about themselves as a manager. It tells them being a manager is important, but I can't genuinely prove impact. I think those benefits are enough, but I get why the board might not. Your thoughts on that?
I think there is actually, there has been research in those sort of areas in terms of impact. I'm now trying to bring up my grey matter in terms of some of the things that I've remembered, but I'm sure there was some research. I'm trying to remember exactly where I heard it, but it was something about the top 10% performing sort of public limited companies, and it was to do with the emotional intelligence, self-awareness, those sort of elements that people had actually done research on in those organizations, and they found them to be a top contributor to success. So I think you're right. Some of these things, the emotional intelligence elements that we look at in the past have seen as these soft skills and things that we can't really quantify. But I think actually there has been quite a lot of work and research, and people have written books on it in terms of it. So I hear what you're saying in terms of these things sound soft and, you know, they're not exactly the impact, but there is research out there actually about all those sorts of skills. And we know the emotional intelligence work has also got proper surveys and ways of analysing it and sort of seeing what the impact is and the impact on the business. So there's more data out there than maybe would appear. It's worth getting a hold of, and I think you're still looking at the strategy, isn't it? Looking at the board strategy, because I think most of the boards that I've worked with and the senior leadership teams I've worked with do understand that the ROI does come from a variety of places, and they do understand that not everything is objective in the sense that you can put a number to it, but you can put subjective sort of more less quantifiable sort of elements to it. So where you're getting those things from, like staff surveys, well-being surveys, those sorts of things. But yeah, there is hard data for some of this stuff actually.
Superb. Thank you for sharing.
Think of it on the top of my head.
I think that's great, and I'm also I'm happy to help out a little bit, because of course this is a conversation that I have daily with clients, is how are we going to measure this program? And I have offered a call for that person as well. So if you do want to reach out to me, we can talk more about how I could give you some ideas with no obligation to buy, just the whole, I can talk about how we approach it and what we measure. I'm consciously aware that there are quite a few people who probably would be interested in this particular topic on the call. So I will sort of, with my background, as many of you know, I used to facilitate for the CIPD, and one of the things I used to facilitate was how do we measure the return on investment. And so I am quite passionate about this. I do bang the drum a lot. So we can do it in a variety of ways. So I would encourage you to always have, for the managers to always have a sponsor within the business, and to ask them to contribute to what's telling you that this person is making progress as they go through their coaching journey. And of course, that can still be the inner game, and that can have an impact. And as Ian says, there are, I believe it's one of the big four. I'm kind of thinking the McKinsey, but don't quote me 100% on that, that did the research and the studies around converting things like emotional intelligence and engagement scores and things like that. And certainly if you work with an employee engagement provider, they would almost definitely have that as well. One of our programs that we measured, we saw a 400% return on investment, and that was measured purely through cash value alone. Now that's rare that we get cash value, I will say, but what you can do is you can also look at things like cost savings. So we've seen examples where we've got a board that's very divided, and where they've collaborated better, we can then start to see actually they've managed to do some cost savings, because working together, whereas before they weren't talking, they've managed to get a better deal from their supplier, and they can also improve some of the systems. So I'd be happy to talk more about that. If any of you are interested, interested, you can see my email in there and feel free to follow up. We do have another question as well. So it says, thanks, Ian. Any insights into dealing with an indecisive board due to bandwidth challenges and a new team, albeit risks associated with slow decisions in, oh, sorry, I've not expanded it enough, with slow decisions is highlighted. I'll start that again. Any insights into dealing with an indecisive board due to bandwidth challenges and a new team, albeit risks associated with slow decisions is highlighted and become a lived experience?
There's always a pain point, isn't there? And I know we talk about pain points and burning platforms and those sorts of things, and you do need that. So part of that thinking is, what is going to create a burning platform, and where is the pain point here? Because without one or both of those, it can be difficult to get things over the line. I appreciate that. I think in terms of bandwidth, it seems maybe this is too obvious an answer. It's almost too obvious. I must think you probably thought about it already, but it's obvious. What can I do? What can we do to speed those things up for them? In other words, what can I provide you with that means you don't have to do a lot of this thinking yourself? Hey, it's a win-win for me if I can do that for you. Now, but also I think, and as you've pointed out, we've said, there's a cost in doing nothing. I know some people who get very frustrated with teams and with boards and senior leaders who can't make decisions. There's a cost in doing nothing, and I suppose it's who on that board or senior leadership team has the influence to say, you're costing me a lot of money here, you're costing us a lot of competitive advantage. There's things that we're losing, we've missed opportunities. I find often people at that level really do hate missing opportunities. So saying things, which is obviously not making anything up, but if you do know you've missed some opportunities, we've missed these 3 opportunities because we haven't made a decision yet. So yeah, what is the pain point? How are you going to get there? What's the burning platform? And what is the cost of doing nothing? And have you really tangibly pointed out what the cost of doing nothing is? Have you got specific examples? You might come back and say, yes, Ian, I've done all that. But yeah, some specific examples. And I suppose in that as well, it's like, who in the room needs this specific example? Because the CFO might need a slightly different specific example from the COO or the chief person officer, people officer, or whatever. Yeah,
I think that's a really, really good point. I think case studies of opportunities that have been missed, I think that they can reflect really well. And I think when we do our ROI, something that we often talk about is the cost of not doing something. You mentioned it earlier, didn't you? What's the cost of not doing this, and what impact does it have? And the only other one I think I would add in there is about storytelling. I think storytelling can be quite concise, especially if you're time poor, but actually give a lot of content. And again, visuals, picture paints 1,000 words. So if you're thinking, I've got this 20 deck and I'm not going to get their time, 2 slides with a storytelling can potentially have some options. And again, very happy to talk more on this. So feel free to reach out to us, because I'm conscious that we don't have all the time in the world today to answer everything. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Ian?
I just thought the other thing that came to mind when I was just thinking there as well is that curiosity element that we discussed earlier, which is what's stopping you from making a decision, and just asking those sort of questions. What is it the risk? Is it a fear of something? Because it might be that's a way as well to sort of say, well, actually, look what we've done on the whole risk element of this project. And we can keep you informed with it along the way. Or maybe it's fear of reputational damage. Who knows? It might just be a fear of making a decision because they're just indecisive and they just don't like making decisions. But there is quite a lot of evidence that when you make a decision, you feel better. So if that's the case, perhaps you could give them an article on that making decisions does make us feel better, even if it hasn't got to be a final decision. You can always tweak it a bit later on. So what is it? A bit of curiosity around what's stopping them from making a decision, as well as things we've already said, perhaps.
There's something else that's just occurred to me as well on that is it's a profile and I can't quite remember the name of it. I think it's called Risk Compass, and it's used a lot with executive boards, where you can often have too much risk, and then you can have the indecisive board. So it's also worth profiling the board, because actually if you've got too many people on your board that are in the indecisive side, which it sounds like you have, then somebody could potentially lend themselves to the other side. So it's a bit like a borrowed strength. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this, where we might go, Ian talked earlier about detail. So perhaps detail might not be my strength, and I might have to think, okay, in this meeting, nobody else is representing that. So how do I step into there and really challenge us? So we might need maybe a couple of members of the board to be the ones that actually go, what would happen if we took a risk here? How would it be to really stretch the comfort zone? I'm just thinking as well that may also lend itself to some team coaching. So yeah, as I say, it's too much to cover on this sort of brief moment of Q&A, but very happy to follow up with that one if you want to reach out to me. My email's in the question below. I have one final question for you, Ian, because I know I wrote loads down, but I haven't got time for all my questions. So
I'm gonna hate your questions. I know I am. Oh my God.
I know.
Brace.
Really kind. I think actually, this one I think is probably one that you will recognise from some of the work that we do.
Oh.
So what if the power on the board sits mainly with one person, typically the CEO or the COO, and although the others on the board might be bought in, the one who is the blocker is the one who holds the power? What's your thoughts on that? You knew I'd give you a difficult one.
Well, I think it comes to, I mean, one of the things, I don't know whether I talked about it much, probably did, but it's a part of the thing with the board and the senior team is who is the decision maker? Because that is a problem, isn't it? If we present to people who are not actually the decision makers and they have to go away and ask somebody else or get some other decision from, I don't know, the mothership in the States or Holland or wherever it is that, the sort of like where you're based internationally, perhaps. So yeah, am I talking to the decision maker? And I think it comes back to things that we've said, really, is really focusing on your preparation. What conversations have you had with the CEO or with people close to the CEO? Are you clear what the CEO really wants? What's the billing platform for the CEO? What's their sort of pet interests, I suppose? Where are they politically? What have you done beforehand? Are you really hitting on what the CEO wants? And I suppose I'm not saying ignore everybody else and what they might want or questions, but you're going to have to really, really prioritize the decision maker in this. And sort of think about what it is they want and are you really answering their questions. But it is often the case that it can stand and fall on one person's decision, unfortunately. And if that is the case, then that is all you can do, I think. And a lot of CEOs might be very driven by the bottom line. That might be something which they're all about. And really then you really have to focus on finding what is this going to do to the bottom line, and you're going to have to be quite convincing about that, because that might be really, they might be interested in other things as well around those edges, but this might be it really, this might be where they make their decisions. So that's the thing you've got to focus on.
Yeah, certainly when you're looking at your profiles with red people in core strengths, or if we're looking at D and DISC, those sort of things, which typically a lot of people who find their way into those roles do have. Some superb work in there. Thank you, Ian. I think you've done a superb job today. As I say, people are just loving it and getting the content that they need. So thank you from me to you. For those of you who are here and curious to know more, I know that there's probably a lot of questions about your own unique systems, processes, organisational nuances. So if you are interested, then as I keep saying, feel free to reach out and I will do my best to arrange a call with myself, with Ian, and we can make sure that we support you to answer some of your questions that you're facing internally. And if you are looking for your leadership development programs, management development programs, talent or team coaching or one-to-one executive coaching, I hope that you'll give us a thought. And Ian runs a lot of our programs, so you've already had a flavour of the wonderful style of his communication. He's even better when he's doing interaction. Not that it wasn't ace today, and it was, but interaction is your baby, isn't it? You do that. So thank you. We will let you go. We're just nearing 3 p.m. Thanks again for giving your time. Sorry, 3 p.m. in the UK. I know some of you are not joining from the UK. So yes, wherever you are, go forth, use the knowledge that you've got today and influence upwards. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Esther.